Good evening and welcome to the University of Kentucky. My name is Paul Vincelli. Co-organizer Dr. Carol Hanley and I are scientists and educators in the UK College of Agriculture. We welcome you to tonight's forum entitled Climate Change, Values, National Security, and Free Enterprise. This event is being streamed live and it will be available on YouTube as well in several weeks. There is overwhelming scientific evidence that the Earth is warming and that human activities are a substantial cause. Tonight's event begins where mainstream science leaves off, and I am excited and honored to be introducing our speakers tonight. Tonight's speakers will address climate change through different lenses. They have been invited to participate in this forum because of their stature on this topic and because of the depth of their thinking. I wish to acknowledge our sponsoring organizations, especially the UK College of Agriculture, the UK Provost's Office, the Tracy Farmer Institute for Sustainability and the Environment, and the Student Sustainability Council. This event is being filmed by Showtime Network, and they are preparing a documentary on the human impacts of climate change, and the title of that documentary is Years of Living Dangerously. So I just wanted to help explain why there are so many cameras and technical staff. I also ask the audience to silence cell phones. And finally, the speakers will entertain questions at the conclusion of all three talks, and we'll have maybe 20 minutes for question and answer. I am thrilled to open the forum with Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, Associate Professor at Texas Tech University. She is an internationally known climate scientist, and she has served as a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an organization that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. In my opinion, one of her most important contributions, among many, many contributions to this important topic, is a wonderful book entitled A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. It was authored by her and Andrew Farley, her husband, and a pastor at their church in Lubbock, Texas. The title of her talk is, Would You Sell Your Car to Save a Polar Bear? I wouldn't. Why I care about climate change, and you should too. Let's welcome her to the University of Kentucky.
Thank you, Paul. All right. People have done surveys asking what's the image that we most commonly associate with the issue of climate change and global warming, and this one always rises to the top, the polar bear. But here's the problem. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. But if you could save one polar bear's life temporarily by selling your car, would you? A polar bear that you would never see again and that might not survive the next year. I think if we're going to be honest, most of us wouldn't. We have other things that we worry about, and as long as we have a couple of polar bears in a zoo, we can always rebreed them in the wild in the future, right? Now, I'm not an ecologist, but I feel like this is what most of us think of. And then whenever we hear about climate change in the news or on the talk shows or on the internet, this is what it sounds like, isn't it? You know, one person saying it's getting warmer, the other one saying, no, it's getting cooler. One person says it's the end of our civilization, the other person says it's just a giant hoax. So I'm going to talk about 4 questions tonight, and the first question is this: is this even a real problem? Or is it something that's been imagined by well-meaning, well-intended people who really prefer to hug trees more than they do to hug another human being? Or is it a problem that's been invented by other people? This is a question many people have asked. Now, I'm really fortunate. As a climate scientist, I don't have to listen to other people's opinions. I actually get to look at the real data. So I get to look at what the Earth is actually telling us about what's happening. I don't have to take anybody else's word for it, and that's an enormous privilege. So the first question I'm going to talk about is, what does the Earth actually have to say about what's happening right now? This is the picture we normally have in mind when we look at the Earth. No traces of human civilization on the face of our planet. But here's the reality. Over the last 1,000 years, the Earth has changed a lot. This is our world population. It took from the beginning of humans until the 1800s to get to 1 billion people. That's a very long time. It took just 13 years to get our last billion people. So our population is growing, and really, a more accurate way to look at the world is like this, a picture of the world at night, which clearly shows the imprint of humans on the planet. This is the US, zooming in a little closer. You might be able to spot Lexington on this map. And move your eyes up a little bit to this kind of amorphous glow up there in North Dakota. Now, is there some enormous city up in North Dakota we don't know about? No. What you're actually looking at is this, the flares of fracking. This is one of the biggest ways that we're impacting our planet. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we discovered how to dig massive amounts of coal and natural gas and oil out of the ground and burn it, we've been producing increasing amounts of carbon dioxide. We've been digging this stuff up from way under the ground, where it would normally stay for about 1 million years, and we've been putting it into the atmosphere really, really quickly, much faster than would naturally happen. We are familiar with some of the more visual impacts of fossil fuel extraction: mountaintop removal in West Virginia, smog over our big cities from burning gas. But what we don't think about so much is what you don't see in this picture. I'm not talking about the steam, I'm talking about the invisible gases in between, the heat-trapping gases that are released whenever we burn coal or gas or oil. Now, some of you may say, well, this is this newfangled science, you know. This is what you guys have just been working on for the last 10 years. This is a picture of the guys who knew about these invisible gases. We have known that we produce these gases as far back as the 1700s. Isn't that crazy? This is a really old science we're talking about here. What does this old science tell us? It tells us that whenever we burn something, here the example is natural gas, and I promise this is all the chemistry we're going to get into tonight. And with this audience, that's probably okay, right? Whenever we burn anything that contains carbon, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we've been burning a lot of it. Anything that costs money, we write down, so we have good records of how much coal and gas and oil, and a little bit from cement making too, we've been burning over the last 150 years. It's been building up in the atmosphere. Here's our population again, and the brown line now is our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Nice and flat until when? Our population started to go up because we use more energy. Why is this a problem? Well, our planet has something called the natural greenhouse effect. As you might imagine from the name, it's natural, nothing to do with people. It keeps our Earth a lot warmer than it would be otherwise. We would actually be a frozen ball of ice if it wasn't for this natural blanket of gases around our Earth. But just like my grandma used to do when I stayed at her house, she would sneak in the middle of the night and pull this extra blanket over us because she was afraid we were going to freeze to death. Now, we did live in Canada, but even still, we do have central heating. And you would wake up sweating later in the night because we didn't need that extra blanket. That's what we're doing to our planet. We are putting an extra blanket on our planet by producing these invisible heat-trapping gases. And it's warmed us so far by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this might not seem like much, but our planet's natural temperature, this is our global temperature back in the 1850s to 1900, our planet's temperature is usually as stable as the human body. What happens if your temperature goes up 1.5 degrees? You don't run for the emergency room, but you might take a Tylenol. You certainly would start monitoring what was happening to you, and even more so if it was your child. That's what's happened now. We have not had a below average cold year since 1976. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands again, but there are some of us in this room who have experienced that and some of it who haven't. So our idea of what's normal has completely changed now because our world is much warmer than it was in our parents' and our grandparents' generation. Question number 2, though, how do we know that we are causing it? Before we kind of jump on the human bandwagon or drink the man-made Kool-Aid, we have to ask, how do we know that it isn't the sun or it isn't a natural cycle? And these are questions we need to ask. luckily, we have the data. And again, this is data that I've actually looked at myself. Here's our energy from the sun in the purple. We have an 11-year sunspot cycle, and then we have the long-term average, which is the thick line. And here's our Earth's temperature, which is the same thing that we looked at before, just a different color. What we see is that up until about the 1970s, both of them were going up. So we're getting more energy from the sun, and we're getting warmer. You know, so far so good, right? But since the 70s, energy from the sun has been going down. So if we were being controlled right now by the sun, we should be getting cooler, and we're not. We've gotten much warmer. So the sun can't be responsible for the changes we've seen over the last 40 years. What about natural cycles like El Nino? Well, what these natural cycles do is just like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. They move heat around between the ocean and the atmosphere. So if the atmosphere is getting warmer, it means the heat's coming from the ocean. If the ocean's getting warmer, it means the heat's coming from the atmosphere. But what we've seen over the last 30, 50, 80, 100 years is that the atmosphere and the ocean are both heating up at the same time. So it can't be a natural cycle. That would violate conservation of energy, be creating energy somehow. What about those cycles, though, that cause the ice ages? You know the little squirrel with the nut? Yeah, anybody who has kids knows what I'm talking about. Could it just be that we're just coming out of the last ice age? Well, when we look at that, what we see is that, in fact, if we look back the last 6,000 years here to 400 BC, our temperature has actually been on a long-term cooling trend. And there was a paper published just last year that showed that the next thing coming in geologic terms in natural cycles is another ice age. So those guys back in the 1970s were right. An ice age is the next thing coming on geologic timescales, except for the fact that we took a U-turn about the Industrial Revolution time. We took a huge U-turn where our carbon emissions started to increase and our temperature is following suit. So we are not heading for an ice age anymore. We are heading in exactly the opposite direction very, very quickly. Here's the real temperature of our Earth, and here's the temperature of our Earth if we didn't have any people on it burning coal and gas and oil. Then what we do is the only difference we do to the physics and the chemistry of our planet is we only add in our emissions of these invisible gases that we've known about for 300 years. We add those into the equation, and this is what we get. A perfect match with what's really happened. In other words, we can't explain our current climate change if we leave humans out of the equation. And believe me, we would prefer to. So what? We're back to the polar bear. Okay, so climate is changing, so humans are playing a role, but why does it matter to me? We don't live here, we live here. Why does it matter to us in the places where we live when we have many more concerns that are a lot more pressing? Our finances, our health, our family, our job. These are the things we care about. It's important because our civilization is built on one assumption. That is that no matter what kind of bumps and wiggles we experience, we will always return to average. We may have a cold year or a warm year. We may have a wet year or a dry year, but we'll always come back to the average. And today, that is no longer an assumption that is safe to make. This assumption determines where we grow our food. It determined how we built our buildings before we had air conditioning. This is what a house in Texas looked like. But what happens if that climate is not stable anymore? What happens if we're seeing warmer weather, more frequent heat waves, more frequent heavy rainfall? What happens if we're seeing less frequent cold events, less snow, more rain? What happens then? That matters to us. Here in Kentucky, we've been getting warmer a little bit slower than the rest of the US. If you look at the entire US, the darker colors show the warmer areas. You see that some areas have actually gotten a little cooler over the last 110 years, I think this is. But the majority of places are warming, and warming quite rapidly, especially in the north and the west. Now you might ask, what's that little warming hole? They actually call it a warming hole. And that's because the increased energy is actually going into evaporating water, so it's getting more humid. That's why there's that little cooler area there. Not because it isn't having more energy, but it's just going somewhere else. Our growing season has gotten longer. This is the number of days the growing season has increased. And this brings other impacts with it. We're seeing that the range of a lot of pests, like this flea beetle, has increased because it can go farther north because it's not as cold anymore. Kudzu. Anybody been down to the south and seen kudzu? Exactly. It's in southern Illinois, all over southern Illinois, and 3 years ago they found kudzu in Ontario, Canada. But they couldn't get rid of it because it was on private land and nobody ever thought kudzu would make it to Canada, so it wasn't on the invasive species list. It made it because the winters were not cold enough in Canada to kill kudzu. We're seeing stronger and more frequent heat waves. I got this actually from a South Carolina weather station. They called this Death Ridge Thursday. This was last summer. We're seeing more frequent events. The risk of these events is changing. We've always had heat waves, but they're coming more frequently than they used to. These heat waves affect us. They affect our health, especially children, people who have respiratory diseases, and elderly people. These are the ones who feel the impacts. It's not just here in the US. In Australia, this winter, their summer, they had a heat wave that was so extreme that, I am not kidding, they had to add an extra color to their weather maps. You see that light purple at the top? That is a new color that they never had before because it had never gotten that hot. Now that's 54 degrees Celsius. You do the conversion, and that is very, very high. We're also seeing more frequent heavy rainfall because the warmer the air is, the more water vapor there is, and so when a storm comes through, it picks up more water and dumps it. So we're seeing major increases, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. What does this mean? This means increased risk of flooding. These are the floods in North Dakota. They're bracing for a new round of floods today. They seem to come every year now, and before it was a 1 in 10, 1 in 20 year event. At the same time, this seems kind of ironic, but the risk of drought is also increasing. This is a picture of the drought monitor from the summer, but what happens is as it gets warmer, the water evaporates out of the soil and it gets drier, and so therefore the droughts are worse because it's warmer. We've always had droughts again, but they're being exacerbated by the warmer weather. Certain types of disasters related to high temperature extremes, heat waves, storms, heavy rainfall events are increasing. We've seen many more billion-dollar weather disasters in recent years than we did in previous decades. We've talked a lot about ourselves, but the reality is that if we look around the world, the people who are experiencing the majority of these impacts do not live here. They live in places where people live on $1 a day, where they spend 100% of their income to try to feed their family, where they eke out an existence on their land just trying to put food in their mouths, not trying to buy the iPhone 8. These are the places that are feeling the biggest impacts, that are the most vulnerable to change. And so if we look beyond our own backyard, we see that, for example, up in the Arctic, there's 300 Native American villages that are at imminent risk from falling into the ocean because they used to be built on frozen ground, and that ground is melting and literally sliding into the water. Now, this is not a Greenpeace statistic. This is the Army Corps of Engineers who determined that these villages were vulnerable. One of them has already had to move, and 12 more are trying to move right now, but they don't have a lot of money. They're just hunters. We don't depend on glaciers for a lot of our water here, but around the world, 1 billion people, almost 1/7 of the world's population, get their water from glaciers. This is the glacier that used to supply Lima, Peru. 8 million people and less than 2 inches of rain a year. Some of this water flowed through irrigation channels built by the Incas. That's how long people have been using water from glaciers. But now Peru has built a desalination plant because there is no more free water coming from this glacier. It has retreated too far up the mountain. As the ocean warms, it feeds our storms. We're not getting any more frequent hurricanes, but we are getting stronger hurricanes. And around the world, 300 million people live within a couple of feet of sea level and are estimated to be environmental refugees within this century. 2/3 of the world's biggest cities are also within a few feet of sea level rise. So lastly, our response. What are we doing about this problem? Well, unfortunately, most of us think it's not a real problem. The number of people thinking that the seriousness of this problem is exaggerated has increased over time. It's divided by party. As you can see, the top line is Republican, the middle is Independent, and the bottom is Democrat. Is it because the science of climate change is in conflict with conservative values? Most of us agree it's a good thing to conserve. It also is divided by religious affiliation. People ask them if this is a different survey, asking if there's solid evidence the Earth is warming. Unaffiliated people, 58% agreed. By the time you get down to my personal group, white evangelical Protestants, we're at 34%. Is it because there's a conflict with our basic theology? Most of us believe God was involved in creating the Earth in whatever way, shape, or form. We also believe that we have a responsibility to steward or care for creation. It was given to people. So science can give us a lot of facts. But in order to decide what to do with those facts, we have to look to our values. And my values come from my faith. And my faith says that we are to love God and love our neighbor. So today, when we look around the world, I have to ask myself, does this look like loving my neighbor? And the answer to me is no, it doesn't. So how can we respond? I'm so excited that we have our two other speakers here tonight, because ordinarily I try to bear the burden of talking about solutions, which is difficult as a scientist. We're about identifying problems, not fixing them, right? But here we have two people who are wonderful at fixing problems. So let me just end by saying that scarce resources and poverty are already threatening people all around the world. Nothing to do with climate change. Climate change is exacerbating those problems. We cannot solve those problems if we leave climate change out of the picture. It's like pouring money into a bucket with an ever-increasing hole in the bottom. Considering those people is, I believe, how we can love our neighbors here and how we can love our neighbors abroad. And I would close with this encouraging verse from Galatians, in the words of the Apostle Paul, that what counts is faith expressing itself through love in whatever way, shape, or form that may take for our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. As I mentioned before, we'll hold questions till the end, and we'll have plenty of time for all questions and discussions and concerns. Tonight's second speaker is Brigadier General Stephen Anderson. He is a 31-year Army veteran, retired in 2010, who, among other responsibilities, served as Chief of Logistics for multinational forces in Iraq from 2006 to 2007. He is now Chief Marketing Officer for Relyant LLC, a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business based in Knoxville, Tennessee. Relyant provides key construction, logistics, munitions response, and information services to U.S. troops deployed overseas in combat zones. The title of General Anderson's talk is Climate Change and National Security. Please join me in welcoming General Anderson.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate that. I'm honored to be part of this forum. I want to thank Carol and everybody else associated with this event. I'm really just, like I said, thrilled and honored to be here. I want to thank you all here for coming too, because I know there's lots probably going on. I'm sure there's a basketball game around here. So, oh, I forgot about that. I'm sorry. I promised Paul I wouldn't mention that. I'm sorry. I know how you guys are about basketball around this part. But look, that was a brilliant presentation we just heard, and she really set the stage. You know, what I'd like to say in response to that is I'd like to think that by the time I get done here in another 20 minutes or so, that we can see perhaps one of the solutions to the problems that she just mentioned. And I believe the military can help lead the way in doing something about climate change. So I'm going to get to that. But as Paul just mentioned, I'm an Army veteran. I'm also a small business owner. So I'm really concerned about the appropriate business climate. And I'm also one of the, evidently, like the 12% of conservative Republicans that actually believes in climate change. But yes, I am a conservative Republican, and I think that most Republicans are on the wrong side of this. But I don't want to make this too political, but I do want to talk about my background and my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan and what I think that the light that I think it sheds on this entire debate. So I'm going to talk about the strategic national security impact of climate change. And then the operational impacts. What does it have to do with our soldiers fighting in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about renewable energy and how, like I said, we can leverage the Department of Defense to help perhaps lead the way, as they have led the way in many, many things and many, many technological and sociological advances in this nation. First of all, what's the impact of climate change? Well, first, I just want to make sure it's understood that what I regard as the greatest threat to our national security, and it's our over-reliance on oil. I'm not saying foreign oil, I'm saying oil. The source of the oil isn't the issue, okay? That attacks a symptom. The problem is the disease. The disease is our addiction. And even if we have an infinite supply of carbon-based fuels, ultimately it's going to be our demise, as you just heard. We've got to do something to fix the disease, not the symptoms. The issue is oil and carbon-based fuels. Now, why is that? Well, Katharine just put out a compelling argument about the reality of climate change. You know, there's a chain of events that essentially occurs because of our oil addictions, I believe, that drives climate change. And what does climate change mean? It means that our world is going to be less stable than it is today. Okay? We've got enough instability in the world already. We don't need any more, ladies and gentlemen. Just look at North Korea. Okay? Talk about instability. But there's tenuous threads holding our whole international system together. And climate change risks pulling those threads apart. And it makes the likelihood that soldiers like myself might have to fight and die in foreign lands in order to protect security. We don't need instability. We need security. We need stability. And climate change is essentially exacerbating that. But if you don't believe in climate change, well, perhaps you believe in supply and demand. And you understand the world out there right now. The competitors for fuel and for oil-based energy are growing every single day. And why is that? Because the rest of the world wants to be just like us. I travel a lot around the world. Everywhere I go, they love Americans. They want to have our standard of living. They want to be able to drive cars, and they want to live in air-conditioned comfort. They want to do all the things that we do, and I want them to be able to do that too. But what that does is that puts competition for the finite resources that carbon-based fuels represent. It's not going to last forever. I don't care if we frack every single acre of the United States. We are still going to run out of the stuff eventually. And we've got to do something now while we can set the conditions for change and not having imposed upon us by external sources. The problem is that when you have more competition for fuel, a finite energy source, increased tension, increased stability, the same things that drive climate change. So whether you believe in climate change or not, it's going to happen. We're going to have more tension, more instability in the world, and we've got to do something about it. I believe that we lack renewable energy in this nation because we haven't set conditions to motivate people like myself and people like those associated with this university and probably in this room right now. The entrepreneurial spirit, the know-how, the intellectual capital of this great nation. We put a man on the moon 44 years ago, and no one has even come close since. Nobody's even scratched the surface of the moon 44 years ago. And how did that happen? Because we focused the nation. President Kennedy focused the nation on putting a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, and we did it. I guarantee you we can do it again if we truly recognize this as a problem. And we focus the incredible intellectual capital of this nation to solve this problem. We can do it. We've got to incentivize people to do it. And when that happens, then it'll take off. I mean, we look at the incredible example of Silicon Valley and what that has done to the world, information technology. Why can't Lexington, Kentucky be the next Silicon Valley only for renewable energy? I ask you, why not? We can. We can if we set the conditions to do that. And unfortunately, we're not doing that. We're letting the petroleum industry dictate the energy environment in this nation, and that's got to stop. All right, so enough of the big picture stuff, the strategic implications of climate change. But let me talk a little bit more personally about my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan as a soldier, and how we are incredibly operationally vulnerable. That the way that we do business and the way that we fight wars and the way that we sustain our forces, we are incredibly dependent upon the same lifeline that this nation's dependent upon, which is oil. There's a good picture there, I hope you can see it in the middle, of a line of fuel trucks essentially going through mountain passes in Afghanistan. Virtually everything that we do in Iraq and Afghanistan or anywhere is dependent upon oil platforms. And we put our soldiers at risk because of it. Here's the first operational impact, and the most heinous: blood. What is the cost of doing business in Iraq and Afghanistan? It's blood. Its blood is being shared. Over 1,000 Americans have died protecting fuel lines and fuel supply lines and moving fuel. Over 1,000. You probably haven't heard that before. We don't do a very good job of sharing that. But that should outrage you. It outrages me. We've got to do something about our incredible dependence on oil. Now, no, we're not going to be able, I'm not saying that we're going to put soldiers driving Priuses out there, okay? I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that we can do smart things now to decrease our dependency on carbon-based systems. And in doing so, we're going to save lives. And that's pretty powerful. How about the operational impact on you, the taxpayer, ladies and gentlemen? If you understand what it costs to move a gallon of fuel from the United States or wherever it's purchased to Afghanistan, one of the most isolated, if not the most isolated country in the world, you'll realize that a gallon of fuel costs at least $50 a gallon, perhaps $500 a gallon. We call that in the military the fully burdened cost of fuel, understanding what it really costs. It's not buying fuel down at the local gas station. It's what does it cost to get the fuel there? Taxpayers last year spent $20 billion to provide the energy for our soldiers in harm's way in Afghanistan. I'll say that again, 20 billion with a B, okay? Imagine even a 20% decrease of that. You know, think about that, what we could do with $3 or $4 billion extra. Think of what we could do to develop renewable energy with $3 or $4 billion. You know, just think about the impact of that, the potential impact of that. We are paying a huge price in terms of blood and in terms of dollars. There's also the operational impact of military effectiveness, because the reason that that fuel is so expensive is because commanders need to invest so many assets in moving and protecting the fuel. There's huge resources. A typical fuel convoy consists of maybe 17 to 20 trucks. But with those 17 to 20 trucks can be upwards of 150, 200 soldiers to do nothing but protect those fuel lines. And of course, when they're out there, they're exposed to the enemy. I mean, the Taliban, you know, the fuel trucks are a huge convenient target for the Taliban. You know, they're essentially large Taliban targets running across the roads. Anybody can hit them. And they make a big boom, and they make a great, great photo op for the bad guys. In fact, if you look at how we're consuming oil and fuel, this is the first war in history in which we're actually funding both sides of the war. Because the money that we spend on oil in this country goes back to the bad guys, ladies and gentlemen. Countries like Iran get $1 billion a day. That money gets put to building bombs and munitions and funding efforts to kill Americans and our NATO allies in Afghanistan. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And a typical convoy through Pakistan takes 17 days to get from the port of Karachi all the way up to our log bases in Afghanistan. And along that way, they're subject to graft and corruption all the way. A typical 9,000-gallon fuel tanker might very well show up at Bagram, which is our large log base up in the north, not with 9,000 gallons of fuel, but maybe 4,000 or 5,000. Why? Because they've been paying off every warlord all the way up there for the past 17 days to get there. Those are the kind of things that happen. Those things happen because we're vulnerable, because we're exposed, because they need the fuel and there's no other way to get it to them. So what would be the impact of renewable energy? Again, I said I'm not advocating that we put soldiers in Priuses. But are there things that we can do in an operational environment that reduce our dependency on oil like that reduce our vulnerabilities, that make us more militarily effective? Are there things? There absolutely are. The technology exists today. Now, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times 2 years ago, and I got all kinds of responses. But one of them was from a company commander named Captain Sean Falcone in a small outpost in Afghanistan. And he wrote, and there's a quote in the upper part of this the slide. He essentially said, I got to stop my operations, my combat operations, once every 2 weeks to go back to my headquarters, my battalion headquarters, and get my fuel. It takes me a day to get there, a day to get back. They're shooting at me the whole time, going up and going back. And when I come back, the enemy is reset in all the positions I just spent 2 weeks getting them out of. And I start all over. He said it's like Groundhog Day. So that there, in fact, demonstrates how we could be operationally and militarily much more effective. What if he didn't have to go back once every 2 weeks? What if he only had to go back once every 2 months? What I'm saying is he would be, not only would be saving money and reducing risks, saving blood, but we'd win the war faster. We'd be more militarily effective. That's what's at stake. So what are some of the things we can do? Well, Afghanistan, there's essentially 340 plus days of bright, sunny sunshine every day, or every year. 340 days. I mean, huge solar possibilities there. Absolutely huge. We could be leveraging solar technologies. We could be looking at Afghanistan as an operational energy test bed to develop technologies like solar, make the solar panels more efficient than they are today, reduce the costs, win the war faster, bring our troops home sooner, all those kind of things. We could be developing an operational energy test bed in Afghanistan that we could develop technologies that come back to the United States and help relieve us of our dependency on oil back here too. And I didn't think of that. Tom Friedman actually wrote that 5 years ago in The World's Hot, Flat, and Crowded. It's a great idea, looking at Afghanistan as an opportunity to develop renewable energy. So what other energies can we develop there that are renewable? Wind. There's a lot of wind out there. And I'm not just talking about in the headquarters areas. I'm talking about, it's a huge, huge area. There's a lot of wind in Pentagon, a lot of wind in Washington, D.C. too, we could certainly harness. But I mean, there's all kinds of technologies out there. We got to set conditions for people to make this happen, though. That's the point. Hydro systems, they got all kinds of mountains over there, all kinds of water, all kinds of glaciers and all kinds of water flowing through there. We could definitely use small, highly efficient hydroelectric systems to reduce our dependencies on oil. Geothermal, I mean, it's a mountain area. There's all kinds of untapped geothermal potential out there. We talked earlier about Iceland, being, all the geothermals that they have. The entire nation is essentially dependent or independent of any kind of foreign oil because they get almost all of their energy developed geothermally. That's what happens when you build a country on top of a volcano, I guess. But we could do the same thing in Afghanistan. We could certainly leverage a lot of it. And I'm not saying we're going to completely eliminate our fuel needs, but we're going to reduce it dramatically. We could potentially reduce it dramatically. And then waste to energy. I'm a soldier. I can tell you we do a good job of generating waste, a lot of it. Well, why don't we use some of that waste and put it to good use and develop waste to energy systems that essentially reclaim that waste in the form of energy. So my point and the bottom line here is that we could have leveraged renewables to have saved lives, billions of dollars, and essentially led the way on a renewable energy revolution here in the United States. And unfortunately, we didn't do that. The war is winding down. It's not going to happen. But I share that with you in hopes that someday that won't be the case, and we won't let this kind of thing happen again. Because I believe the DOD and the military can lead a great deal of reform. And if you look through history, and there's a few examples up there, look at what the Army and the military has done to develop the internet, improve race relations through desegregation. You can talk about don't ask, don't tell, and other things like that. Missile programs, space programs, GPS. We wouldn't have GPS if not for the military. And I can go on and on with all kinds of. But the point is this: DOD can lead change in this nation. So I'm asking you to help me require DOD to do that, to put pressure on our leaders in Washington to require the kind of DOD energy reform that we know needs to happen. We need to set conditions for change in this nation, and we can do it through the Department of Defense. There's a great asset available to this nation. It has led change in the past, and it can do so in the future. And so I ask you and your support in doing that, letting DOD help us lead the way. One final point. Climate change is real. It's with us. And indeed, just recently, the commander of all Pacific forces in the Pacific, Admiral Sam Locklear, stated that climate change was the greatest threat to to essentially the security of his region. He said the biggest long-term security threat to the Pacific region is climate change. Well, of course, there's many people on the Republican side of the House that didn't support that. One of them was Jim Imhoff, the senator from Oklahoma. And he said that quote there, I just couldn't help but sharing with you. He said, I wish that all the damn retired generals and admirals would just go fishing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going fishing. And an awful lot of people just like me aren't going fishing. There's a lot of people in the military that want to get it right. And they want you to help us set conditions to get it right and drive renewable energy development in this nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Anderson. And once again, for those on the internet that just joined us, we'll hold questions until the third and final speaker is complete, who is Representative Bob Inglis. His many accomplishments include 12 years of public service as a Republican congressman from South Carolina. Following that, he became a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University and also taught at Duke University. Most recently, he launched the Energy and Enterprise Initiative in July of 2012, which is affiliated with George Mason University's prestigious Center on Climate Change Communication. And when I first, I don't think I told you this, but when I first learned of your work and the orientation of your work in the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, I emailed Alex, your staff member, and told him I wanted to just jump out of my chair. I was so happy, and he gave me permission to do so in his return email. So tell him I said hello. The title of Representative Inglis's talk is Free Enterprise Approaches to Energy Security and Climate Change. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Paul. And so I'm the politician on the scene, right? That means that it's sort of like Pat Schroeder. Anybody remember Pat Schroeder? She was a member of Congress from Colorado. She once said, she and I agreed on nothing. Perhaps we could have both agreed that today is Thursday. But she's very liberal, and she wouldn't mind me saying that. And I'm pretty doggone conservative, right? But she said something one time that was really, I thought, very entertaining. She said, most members of Congress are not held in very high esteem. And that was in the good old days when we were actually held in a little bit higher esteem. And so she used to have this thing. She said, don't tell my mother I'm a member of Congress. She thinks I'm a prostitute. Here I am to represent the world's oldest profession, and happy to be here. So having just heard from some really capable folks, General, I am very excited about you not going fishing. And, I have only one career regret, and that is not serving in the U.S. military. And it's wonderful that people like the General here don't have that regret. And I'm very excited to be here with my friend Katharine Hayhoe, who I go around telling everybody is the genuine article, a climate scientist of faith that puts those two things together and doesn't see a challenge to faith in science, but rather a celebration of faith that really drove the scientific method. That's where the scientific method comes from. The advances in the scientific method come from people of faith who thought that the creation had order that reflected the beauties of the Creator, and they were out there to discover them. And so now somewhere along the way, people of faith got in this strange spot of being opposed to science, which is, if you think about it, is a really weird place for people who believe that the creation is orderly and reflects the beauties of that Creator. It's great to be here with both of them. So I'm here to, as a politician, I guess, to give some political advice, right? Here's some advice. If you're a student here tonight, you might be thinking about running for Congress someday, okay? So here's what you do. Don't go out and hire a pollster. Very expensive. Just go look in the Wall Street Journal and check the first question in the poll, the national survey they do. Once a quarter they do it. And it'll say, the first question is, generally speaking, would you say we're on the right track or wrong track in this country? And that question, the answer to that question, will determine whether you should challenge your incumbent member of the House or the Senate. So in 1992, when I first ran for Congress, October of 1998, 70% wrong track. And in a miracle, I won a challenge race. 1998, I'd served 6 years in Congress. I ran for the Senate. Right track, wrong track, October of 1998, 70% right track. I was the challenger challenging a 32-year incumbent U.S. Senator named Fritz Hollings. Note to self, they do not give pink slips to 32-year incumbents running in 70% right track territory. So I lost. I was out 6 years, practiced commercial real estate law again, came back to run for Congress again in 2004. Wasn't a right track, wrong track question because Jim DeMint had vacated the seat to run for the Senate, and so I had the opportunity to run an open seat. Won, and I announced this new program in English 2.0, we called it, the new and improved version. The old had been English 1.0. We said that we're going to be really focused this time on energy. That was okay in 2004, okay in 2006. Still sort of okay in the early 2008, but then the financial collapse came at the end of 2008. And the end of 2008, it really was getting sort of bad, had the 10 cycle coming. And here's further political advice for you aspiring politician students, is it's tough to be talking change in the midst of the Great Recession. Because when people feel institutions quaking around them, they look for comfort food, they look for comfort oil, they look for comfort coal. They want everything the way it's always been, and we don't want anything changing. And so if you're a change agent in such circumstances, it's going to be tough slogging. And so in that race, I lost in a Republican primary in June of 2010. And I'd committed various heresies. You know, I'd been for comprehensive immigration reform. That seems to be turning around on our side of things on the Republican Party. I had voted to disapprove Joe Wilson's outburst. I had done some things that were clearly problems politically. But the most enduring heresy was just saying that climate change was real, and let's do something about it. Because what that meant is I was basically taking the view of the other tribe. And here's further political advice for you, is you got to be careful in cross-tribal work. Because what happens is your own tribe then comes to distrust you and the result is that they toss you out because they think that you're not true to the tribe. But you know, it depends on what you define the tribe as. We've just heard from the general a different definition of tribe. And he's also right about that hot air in Washington. That really could power a lot of power stations if we could just figure a way to harness it. But the tribe really is not, as Americans, this Republican versus Democrat thing. If you saw those caskets in the general's picture, you realize that I don't know whether those are Republicans or Democrats. And I had the wonderful opportunity to see the world's most impressive people in 5 trips to Iraq and 4 to Afghanistan. By the way, not the Iraqis or the Afghans. They're wonderful folks, I'm sure. But the Americans serving there are the most impressive people in the world. And you know, I never asked any one of them which tribe they were a member of, Republican or Democrat. Because, you know, when you're in a war zone, you're just an American. And so you would think that they could count on Congress to rise above this tribal thing that we got going in the R and the D camp and be able to hear Katharine Hayhoe say something about science and just say, okay, we're going to do something then, right? And we're going to, if you rise to the highest level that she was talking about, a citizenship of heaven, you realize it's not even an American versus them tribe. It's all of us in this together in the whole of God's creation. So there's some political advice for you, right? To be careful about these things, though, students of politics, because if you're talking in dangerous times, or politically dangerous times in a Great Recession, people don't want to hear that change stuff. They want to just keep what they got. So I need 2 volunteers. I need some student volunteers here, some energetic student, one that's sort of oh, here we got 2 students right here. Okay, come on up here. I need you to come help me. All right, so come right up these steps over here. Here they come. This is terrific. They got, okay, so now which one of you is feeling sort of traditional here tonight? Sort of come right over here. Now, one of you needs to be sort of on the leading edge, cutting edge. The other needs to be more traditional, all right? It was sort of the one that's into comfort and the one that's into change, all right? Which one? Who wants to be?
You can. I don't know.
Okay, you got to be change, all right? You got to be comfort, all right?
Okay.
Okay, now, here's what I want you to do. You're in the business of making power, all right? And one of you can make it in a traditional way. Your name is?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, okay. Elizabeth is going to make power in sort of a traditional way. And your name is?
Haley.
Haley is going to make it in a new way, all right? So, Elizabeth, now let me show you how to make power, okay?
Okay.
This is, now as I talk on here, you know, people can be nodding off and everything, so you're going to need to introduce some power to the room.
Okay.
So here's how you make power. It's like this. You go around and then you, okay, you got to go around and then, okay, that's how you're making power.
Okay.
Elizabeth is making traditional electricity, we're going to call this, all right?
Okay.
Now, Haley, on the other hand, is making different power, new kinds of power, all right? Now, Haley, this is the way you do it. Just sort of silently, or if you want to hum a little bit, it's okay. You can go like this, round like this, okay? This is how you're going to make power. So you're going to go around the room when we need power. I'm going to call for it here because as I talk on, really, these people are going to start going sleepy. So I'm going to say, we need a little bit more energy, and then you go like this. If you want to hum or sing, it's okay, too. I mean, just make a little noise, but that's how you make power, okay? Haley's making a new kind of power. Elizabeth is making traditional power. Now, your job is to go out in the audience and make some power, all right? So just walk around and be making power while I talk on, because we need the energy level to come up here as I'm talking, because otherwise these people can go to sleep. Okay, so
Do I
now,
have to do this constantly?
yeah, yes. Well, we won't wear you out, but just go around and blow some bubbles and enjoy it with the crowd. You know, make sure to get them playing with your bubbles there. You know, now there you go. Wait a minute now. Haley, come over here. You're making power this way. Yes, we got to separate you. Elizabeth, now make sure to get them on the crowd, get to the crowd and give them some power as you go, because that's how you're making electricity, all right? Okay, good. Good. Okay, now keep blowing over there, Elizabeth. You're the key to this, and Haley is too, to the power we need in this room, all right? Okay, so we're making some power here, and I got a new definition of sustainability to offer to you. It comes from Carlos Gutierrez, who's an entrepreneur in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He recycles PET, the stuff that water bottles are made out of. The virgin PET manufacturers thought that there would be no challenge from Carlos because he'd have to heat the goo in order to take the recycled bottles and return them to a form that he could sell to Coca-Cola. Well, Carlos is a Georgia Tech engineer, and he went to Japan and he looked at some rice sorters. And he realized that if rice sorters can identify discolored rice and hit it with an air jet and knock it out of the stream, he could do the same thing with bits of plastic. And so he brought the rice sorters back and he turned it into the ability to basically sort plastic after grinding it. And he can now sell recycled PET at a lower price point than virgin PET. Now you're talking about something that's offensive to the virgin manufacturers. I mean, they go out and they cook this stuff, right? And then Carlos gets it out of the dump. He cuts it up, grinds it up, he runs it across these sorters, and he sells it to Coca-Cola at a lower price point than the original stuff. So he told me the definition of sustainability that we use at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. He said to me, sustainability means making a profit. If you can make a profit, it's sustainable. If you can't, it is not. We accept that as a definition of sustainability. You know, because a lot of people talk about sustainability, but it's pretty clear they got a sugar daddy somewhere that's supporting them, that's supporting their altruism. But you know, as soon as your sugar daddy wears out, I got a hunch you're no longer altruistic. And I will find you to be just as much the survivor on the television show as everybody else, right? And so you got to figure out a way to make this power sustainable. So here comes good. We got Haley making power the new way. See that? And we got Elizabeth making it the old way. Make sure to favor plenty of people with those bubbles. Those bubbles are fun. Okay, so they're making the power for us to carry on here, right? And so sustainability, the question is now, between these two forms of power, by the way, so again, over here we got Haley making it a new way, and we got Elizabeth making it the old way. Old way is basically, of course, in the case of electricity, fossil fuels, right? We got coal-fired electricity, we got natural gas-fired electricity. Those are some very common ways to make electricity, and they work very well, right? What Haley's illustrating over there is maybe wind or solar. So a little audience participation. Which would be more expensive for you to buy at your house? Haley's power, the newfangled green energy, let's say, with solar or wind, or Elizabeth's, which is the traditional coal-fired electricity. So which would be more expensive? Tell me. Which? In Kentucky, wind. Okay, there you go. What else? Somebody else had somebody else. You're right. We're probably in most places it's assumed that you're going to pay more for Haley's power that she's back there producing with, as you notice, nothing coming out, but she's making power. Meanwhile, we got Elizabeth up here, and make sure to go right down that center aisle right there and go in favor of people on both sides with some of your product. As she's making power, something's happening, right? Something's coming out. And so there are perhaps emissions or various consequences to this, right? So now here's what I want you to do. I think we've got, she's keeping on going down the aisle. I got her to go down that one last aisle, and then I'm ready to call them back up here so I can illustrate something to you. So what we are talking about at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative is this idea of a true cost comparison between competing fuels. Right now, the power that Haley's making looks more expensive, right? and therefore, and also less reliable, because she's got maybe wind and solar, and the wind isn't shining, or the sun isn't or the wind isn't blowing, or the sun isn't shining. Haley's not making power. Elizabeth is making power pretty much 24/7. But now I want both of you to come back up here. I need Haley and Elizabeth up here in the front, and I need everybody who was touched by one of Elizabeth's bubbles to please join us up here, right in front. So Haley and Elizabeth, you'll come right over here, and then right down here, and you stand right here. And anybody who's touched by a bubble, just come right up here and join us if you would. Right, line up right here in front. And so you just enjoyed the bubbles, and this is working pretty well. I'm so glad y'all are participating and catching the bubbles. I've done this in audiences before when nobody touches the bubbles and the illustration doesn't work at all. So anyway, yeah, oh, perfect. Come right up. My goodness, Elizabeth, you're doing great power. You're doing a great job. Make a row right across here. Okay, now I got to leave the microphone and talk real loud. So here's what I want you to do. Let's see. Microphone, great. Okay, so I need a little bit of separation right here. You all move this way. Let's see. Two of you go over there, a little bit more that way, okay? Now, you all move a little bit down this way. Right there, stop right there, and then you all go this way. Okay, that's good right there. Now, you move a little bit this way, slide in this way. Oh, we got our two power producers here. Elizabeth, I need you to go stand right at the end, and Haley, go stand at the end down here. Okay, so, and then all of y'all are just perfect right here. Now, Haley was making this power that has no emissions, right? And it's more expensive. And therefore, it's all pretty clear that her power is just going to cost us all more. And my job here, as I said, I'm not the scientist, that's Katharine, and I'm not the general, that's the general up there. I'm the politician who's giving you some political advice. Tough to do, to run for Congress and say, here's a guy who got a great plan for you people. I'm Bob Inglis, I'm running for Congress, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to put the real cost on the meter for electricity, and you're going to pay more for power. Vote for me, Inglis for Congress. Hey, anybody with me yet? I mean, it's a hard sell, right? Because you think, who wants to do that? Man, we don't need to look at any polls. We know that you can't sell that. You can't run for Congress saying, we're going to put all the price on electricity. We're going to have a true cost comparison. We're going to see what's sustainable, because people don't want to pay more for power. But for every conservative in the room, let me ask you if you remember Milton Friedman's book, 1975. The title of it is There's No Such Thing as a Free Lunch. So, Elizabeth over there, give us one last blast of power here. Elizabeth over there is making some power, right? Here it comes. There she goes. There she goes. There it is. Coal-fired electricity, natural gas, great stuff, 24/7, and dirt cheap. It's so cheap in South Carolina, I don't even know what I pay for power. It's that cheap. But I'm sorry to tell you that if you were hit with one of Haley's bubbles, you now have lung disease. From the small particulates, the soot that came out of her plant. So, that stinks for everybody that got hit by a bubble, right? But now, the rest of you, please either take out your wallet or at least put your hand on your wallet right now. Because if Milton Friedman's right, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And we're now going to pay for Haley's cheap electricity, Elizabeth's cheap electricity. Because these folks down here are covered by Medicare. You just paid through your taxes. There's a Medicare tax, you just paid it. 1.45% on your payroll, your employer pays 1.45%. You just paid for these people who have lung impairments, who went to the hospital with asthma attacks because of that cheap power. These folks are Medicaid recipients. You just paid for them through general tax revenues. They're part of the deficit. They're part of the deficit too. These folks are folks who join you on Blue Cross and Blue Shield or whatever insurance policy you have, your premiums just went up because you just paid for them at the hospital. Or and then we should have another category too of the cost shift people, the people that came in without a Medicare card, without Medicaid, and without an insurance card, and they are part of the thing called cost shift, which means that their cost gets shifted onto you. So now back with your hand on your wallet, you just paid for Elizabeth's power, but in a different way. You paid through an opaque healthcare system that you can't control. So now, back to Milton Friedman's book. Do you want a free lunch? Do you really believe that you can get a free lunch, that you can somehow get away with paying the cheap electricity price? Or do you think you're really paying the whole cost for electricity? So now y'all can all go back to your seats, and thank you very much for Haley making that nice power. You can keep the bubbles, and so can you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. So thank you to all those folks. So what that's about, what I've just illustrated, is something, I said this, further political advice. I once talking to our local newspaper, and I said something, the guy asked me a question about this energy stuff I was working on in English 2.0. And I said, yeah, what we got to do is internalize the negative externalities. He said, Bob, what did you just say? And I said, we got to internalize the negative externalities. He laughed out loud. He said, man, I cannot put that in my newspaper. He said, could you break that down for me? And I said, we're going to expose the hidden cost. What you've just seen is an illustration of the internalization of negative externalities, the hidden cost that we don't see, that if you put on a product, then you can have that sustainability that Carlos Gutierrez is talking about. Because right now, if you're in business trying to sell Haley's power, you can't do it unless you've got somebody altruistic. But my wife and I have 5 kids, 2 in college, 1 going to medical school, and I can assure you we don't have the money to be altruistic. So therefore, we're not into buying Haley's power. We're into buying Elizabeth's power, just like everybody else, because it's what we gotta buy. And we can't control that opaque healthcare system. But what if we started changing that? What if we did something that conservatives really believe in, which is accountability, and say, you know, bear all your cost, be fully accountable. And by the way, if that sounds familiar to Katharine's point about biblical accountability, you know, under biblical law, you can't do on your property something that harms your neighbor's property. If you do, that person has a biblical cause of action against you, which was enshrined in English common law, which was then adopted in American common law. That is the law of our land. So the idea here is just to be fully accountable for all of the cost and then watch the free enterprise system deliver solutions. The reason that I don't call the solar hot water heater installer in South Carolina, I think they might be existent, but I don't know of any, is because power is so cheap through the meter, but not through the healthcare system, but I can't control that. So I just keep on using that cheap power. And I don't ever place the call to the solar hot water heater installer who could cut my power usage by about 1/3 at my house. And if you go to those places that the general served, you go across Israel and Jordan and on into Iraq, places like that, solar hot water heaters on almost every structure. Why? Because the energy resource is there, why not use it? Why don't we have them? Because the power is so cheap, or Elizabeth's power looks so cheap, that it doesn't make sense for me to buy a solar hot water heater. Because I don't have the money to be altruistic. But if we started with this concept of accountability, and we said, no, we're going to have a true cost comparison, all the costs are going to be in on all the fuels, then maybe things would start changing and the economics would drive this thing, and the innovation that the general talked about that got us to the moon would take us to a new place in energy in this country. Let me close with this. I've just given you some political advice, right? I'll now end with some life advice to those aspiring politicians here. The worst thing in the world is not losing an election. The worst thing in the world is losing your soul. When you know there are things you believe in and you're not willing to stand for them, That's worse than losing an election. So if you're one of these aspiring politicians here tonight, please lead this nation to solve the problems that we face. And you know, I had this wonderful opportunity to be at a conference in Ireland recently, and I thought it was going to be sort of criticized as those laggard Americans are dragging behind. That wasn't what they told me. What they told me is, we're counting on you, Americans, to solve this problem. They love us in Ireland. They think we're great. And they think we're the indispensable nation. And it felt an awful lot like Winston Churchill looking to the United States. Because you know, Sir Winston said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. And so we're in the course here of exhausting every other option as we go around this tree, having denial of science and basically some kind of ideology that stands in the face of facts. And at some point, with enough courage to follow people like the general, we're going to have some politicians come up out of the foxholes and take this hill. Some of them may lose their elections. But I hope, if you're planning on running for Congress, I hope you'll plan on losing your election at some point by leading, because it's the only way to achieve something for this nation. So give me an amen, I'll stop preaching. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Representative Inglis. And yeah, they're all pulling up their chairs. Thank you. Get you close to your microphones. And so we'll take questions for about up to maybe about 20 minutes, and comments as well. And we'll have a microphone brought here to the front so that you can be heard as you offer your questions. And we will also take questions from the internet audience as well, if there are any that are submitted that way. So, so I invite questions from the audience, including the media, by the way, if there are media members here.
Katharine mentioned associations of attitudes toward global warming and political affiliation and also religion. Do you have any explanation for those associations?
That's a great question. No, this is not on. Is it on now? It is? Okay. If you look back about 15 years when they first started doing polls on people's perspectives on climate change and global warming in the US, at that time there was not a significant difference between people's responses based on their political affiliation. What happened in the last 15 years? There's a lot of theories, and I don't think there's any one answer, and I'm going to hand this over to my colleagues afterwards to give their opinions. But I think what happened was that up until that point, this was an abstract concept. But back in 1988, Dr. Jim Hansen from NASA testified before Congress that this was a real problem with real impacts on the US, and people began to look for solutions. And as soon as it moved from an abstract issue to a concrete issue that required policy solutions and changes in our lifestyle, that's when it became a threat to the status quo. And make no mistake, there are large amounts of money being invested in confusing us, lying to us, and harassing myself and my colleagues. Reasons.
That's a great question. There is a absolutely magnificent frontline piece that was done probably about 6 months ago on this very issue about how since in 2008, it seemed like there was so much political momentum starting to build, and how it all just evaporated into thin air. And the scientists, quote scientists, that are shooting holes in the brilliant work that people like Katharine are doing to show the reality of it. You got to see that, because it really does a magnificent job of showing how it's shifted. One of the issues, I think, with climate change is that, unfortunately, the initial messenger was Al Gore. And he's absolutely right in everything he says, but it was a polarizing, he's a polarizing politician, and a lot of the conservatives railed against anything that he has to say. And unfortunately, you get a lot of people out there. Again, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican. A lot of people say, well, if Al Gore is for it, I'm against it. And unfortunately, that I think might have been, one of the explanations for why, it hasn't generated the kind of momentum, hasn't continued the momentum that we had in 2008.
The PBS special is called Climate of Doubt.
Yeah, that's right. Climate of Doubt. Fantastic.
I guess what I would add to that is I think that when conservatives hear about climate change, I think what we assume is that if we accept the science and accept that we're at risk, then it follows that we must have a bigger government regulatory approach to deal with the problem, and that we don't like. So therefore, since we don't want to see that outcome, we stick on this question about whether it's real or not. What we exist to say is it doesn't have to follow that there is a big government, nanny state regulatory solution. Rather, if you just put all the cost in and make all the competitors fully accountable for all their costs through an elegant price signal, through an upstream application of a carbon tax that's paired with a reduction in other taxes so there's no increase in the size of the government, that then you have this elegant price signal that will drive the innovation. It doesn't have to be a big government response. So I think that a lot of conservatives stick on that first question because they don't want to follow it to the conclusion, which is you got to have a big government. But we don't have to have a big government solution here. The price signal will really work and work faster, I believe, than a regulatory solution. And the regulatory solution is a big government kind of deal.
I've been learning a lot lately from my son. He's in kindergarten, and we're reading American history books together. I think because it has a lot of guns in it. But what that reminded me, which I sort of knew before, but I never put the pieces before, was that what was the foundation, what was the tinder, what was the spark that lit the American Revolution? Taxes and government control. What do people think of when you mention climate change?
Right.
Exactly, the same two things. So it's really no surprise. I feel like an aversion to these things are burned into the American psyche for centuries.
These are great comments. I don't want to interrupt them, but I also want to, if there's a pause here, I'll note that we have some great questions from the internet, Gary. So I'm going to ask a question from the internet, and then we'll go on to you. Why can't General Anderson's ideas be implemented in the U.S.? What barriers are standing in the way?
Well, I think the primary barrier to the DoD situation and the lack of acceptance for renewable energy technologies is because the leadership of the Department of Defense has not adequately addressed it as a requirement. They don't see that it's something that we're required to do. Despite the billions that we're wasting, despite the blood that's been shed, no significant leader at the top has recognized that we need to do this. Now, for instance, how was the Army, the military desegregated? The Secretary of Defense signed a half-page memo that says, we're going to do this. Actually, the President of the United States, President Truman, we're going to do this, and it's going to be effective on this day, and that's it. That was the policy. What we need is a similar policy at the top that says we are going to drive change throughout the entire Department of Defense. And we're going to do that now. And everybody's going to be accountable and responsible for all their energy usage. Right now, we don't have any of that right now. We're going to develop metrics to measure our usage throughout DoD. We don't have any of that right now. And commanders are going to be essentially assessed and evaluated and potentially fired because they don't get on board. That's how you drive change. And unfortunately, that has never really caught on for a lot of, political reasons that we've talked about right here. But, in essence, that's what needs to happen. The Secretary of Defense needs to sign something that says this is a priority throughout the command, throughout the Department of Defense. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen now.
Thank you. Make a couple comments. Under Barack Obama's administration, I've understood that on his top 3 priorities is going to be global climate change. Secretary, I think, Leon Panetta made a national security issue recently. A couple of different things there. I've had the pleasure of working for the state of Kentucky for over 11 years, regulating the coal industry for Kentucky. I've also graduated from UK in forestry, so had the pleasure of working in both sectors of the carbon industry. My question is, there's a lot of discussion, is the efficiency of hydrocarbons versus renewables. As I understand, in 2007, there was less than 1% of our sectors were in renewables. I mean, at some point, these fuels have to be in the marketplace, and they have to be competitive. Unfortunately, we had some subsidy efforts by the Obama administration, and I don't think it turned out as great as we would like to have had that. But anyway, I just want to let you know there's been a lot going on in the past. Kentucky used to be number 1, 2 co-producer. Now we're down to 3. We do produce a lot of emissions for the state of Kentucky. There's a lot of livelihoods that are affected in the coal industry as well, in eastern and western Kentucky, and there's consequences. One last thing, in 1992, Al Gore gave a talk. They had a Real to the Capitals conference in Louisville, Kentucky, and he had some talks. The main thing we were talking about that is Agenda 21. There's consequences when you put people under an umbrella and you basically tie their hands, and it affects their standard of living, like in developed countries, and you don't do the same thing for large countries like China and India, and you allow them to not have these restrictions. So I think the main thing is we get to the basics of global climate change to where it's understandable, inputs and outputs, and the consequences of certain things that are going on. So I just want to share that with you, as well as the effect of the sun's activity on the earth, which you address as well. So thank you, I appreciate it. A couple good comments.
Thanks.
Yeah, let me pick up on one of those, which is the why the renewables don't compete very well. It really has to do with Haley's as opposed to Elizabeth's deal. Yeah. Elizabeth has a sweet deal, but that she just gets to belch and burn for free. And she's just not accountable. The general just mentioned it. I think it's interesting that in the military context, really, accountability is a key topic. And it's a key thing for conservatives. It's a key thing for religious conservatives. People of faith generally believe the whole underpinning of human dignity is this idea of moral accountability, that we are morally responsible beings, and this is a very important part of faith, really. So accountability is key, right? And so what we do here is we let Elizabeth belch and burn for free. Now, we regulate it a little bit, and we let her, but we don't regulate her to the extent of saying, no, all cost in. Be fully accountable. Now, if Elizabeth were made fully accountable, Haley would have a shot in some places. Yeah. And our contention at the Energy Enterprise Initiative is it would happen much more rapidly than we can imagine, because you'd have people chasing the almighty dollar and trying to make a buck off of being Haley. Mm-hmm. They can't make it right now. You can't do it. It's Haley. You got to have a subsidy in order to have wind power. Why? Because Elizabeth keeps on getting away with doing what she does. But if you you say, Elizabeth, no more of that. Be fully accountable. Mm-hmm. Then in some places wind will win. In other places natural gas will win. Other places nuclear will win. Mm-hmm. But it should start, I believe, with eliminating all subsidies for all fuels. That means no more cylinders, no more boondoggles like that. But it also means no more getting away with the implicit subsidy of being able to belch and burn for free. In other words, put them all in, all cost in, true cost comparison. You start there, then you put that cost by approximating it through a carbon tax. And conservatives usually don't like those two words together, carbon and tax. We really don't like the word carbon, but we surely don't like it when paired with the word tax. But if you get quickly to the third point, which is eliminate some other tax in equal amount, cut some equal amount so that you're not growing government, and then fourth, make it a border adjustable tax so that you're not decimating American manufacturing. If you do that package together, then free enterprise will deliver very rapid progress on this. Because you have people like the general now in business making money doing it. And they'll have the incentives set up in the right way.
I was just going to accentuate that point. If you understand what the representative's saying about understanding costs and truly accounting for costs, you know, and of course some of the costs I was talking about were the cost of blood that's being shed in Afghanistan and Iraq. But if you truly understand costs, then we will incentivize a green economy, a renewable energy driven economy. And I fully understand that there are many people in this state that work in the coal industry. But for every person that's working today in the coal industry, sir, I think there could be 1,000 people working in this great state in a renewable energy technology. And we could turn, as I said, thank you, we could turn Lexington, or anywhere for that matter, into the Silicon Valley of renewable energy. It could be done, you know, the right incentives, but it all starts with understanding the true costs.
Yeah, let me take a question from the internet, and then you'll be next. Thanks, thank you. This is, well, it says for Katharine, but everyone's invited to respond. The Economist magazine said this week that warming has plateaued. Why is that?
That's a good question. It's a good example of the things that we hear all the time on TV or on the internet. You know, with 24-hour news, we have to find something to fill the news, right? And every once in a while, you'll hear that global climate change has slowed down, or it's stopped, or it's plateaued, or it's reversed. Where those come from are two things. They come from a misunderstanding, first of all, of what global is, and second of all, what climate is. I mentioned earlier about natural cycles, how they shift heat between the atmosphere and the ocean and the atmosphere. So sometimes when we have an El Nino, it takes heat out of the ocean and puts it into the atmosphere. When we have a La Nina, it takes heat out of the atmosphere and puts it into the ocean. So over short periods of time, our atmosphere temperatures can plateau because more of that heat's going into the ocean. But it's going to come right back out again, just give it a couple more years. So we have to understand, number one, it's a global problem. It's the ocean plus the atmosphere plus the land plus the ice. And number two is climate is the average of weather over about 30 years. So next year might be cold. Does that mean there's no global warming? No. Next year might be warm. Does that mean there is global warming? No. It's a 30-year problem. We have to have a long-term view. So whenever you hear that in the news, that's why. People have forgot that it's global, and they forgot that it's climate, not weather.
I would just mention that show we talked about, Climate of Doubt, does a wonderful job of laying out some of the people that are fighting climate change use that technique. They're looking at a 10-year span, for instance, instead of a 30-year span. You know, I mean, it's equivalent to the guy saying, well, look, you know, we don't have climate change. You know, I started measuring temperature in October, and here it is in March. Look how cold it's been this last 6 months.
Exactly.
It's the same thing. They're looking at a subset of the problem. And you know, and the show does a brilliant job of uncovering the people that are doing that. Yeah. You know, the point is, though, that you're always going to have scientists that are going to be doubtful. I mean, we want that. That's the way our communities work. That's what one of the foundations of this great nation is. You know, we have the right to disagree, and people are going to look at the same sets of data and come up with different conclusions. But the fact of the matter is, and this is fact, the overwhelming majority of climatologists and scientists in the world today believe that climate change is real. That is a fact. You know, and if you got sick and you went to see 20 doctors, and 19 of them told you you needed to have surgery, and one of them said, no, you don't really need to have surgery, you're fine. I guarantee you what every person in this room would probably do. They'd go with what the 19 told them. And that's roughly about I think the ratio of scientists. You know, 19 doctors are telling you, we need to do something now. We need to fix this. You need to have a surgery, or you need to have an operation. One guy, and there's always going to be that one guy that's going to be out there saying, no, the sky isn't falling. But the fact of the matter is, climate change is real, and the scientific community supports that conclusion.
let's take the next question here.
Hi, yes. I really enjoyed your perspectives tonight. I feel like you're on my side on this because I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm a conservative. I teach science here at UK in the geology department. I teach about climate change every year. So it was nice to hear this perspective. Sometimes there's a false dichotomy between conservatives and evangelicals and science and all these issues. So I'm glad to see that people like you exist out there. Let's see, I wanted to bring up a point about hidden costs, and there are hidden costs in renewable energy as well. One of the things I learned about preparing my lectures was that wind energy is dependent on rare earth elements used to make the motors in those things, those strong magnets that are made out of neodymium, things like that. Turns out we have one rare earth element mine in the United States, which isn't even operational. We are heavily dependent on China and other countries for this resource, which is so important. So do you see that, General, as a security risk? Some of these materials that we need to build these green energies, we don't seem to be producing them here at home anymore.
No, I don't think it's a risk, and here's why. Because I believe that there's other solutions to that problem than that specialized metal. I believe that if we focus the scientific community as we did to put a man on the moon, we will find other solutions to those rare earth metals. We will find other ways to do the same job. And the reason that we're not finding those ways is because we haven't incentivized the business community to go out and do that. You know, we can't be reliant upon universities and scientists to do everything. We need to incentivize people like me and my companies and the people that I work with to go out and do the right thing and find these technologies and find these. I mean, our nation is the foundation of our nation is incredible business acumen and industrial might and capability. We need to focus that on the problem of renewable energy development. So while temporarily that's an issue, I agree, and obviously, you know, if we're dependent upon a rare earth metal that's in China, but if we get people in the climate setting conditions to find other solutions, we will do it. Right now, we don't have that.
Thanks for having a talk on climate change on this campus, dominated by the coal industry, which forbids these conversations often. So thank you for the organizers in putting this together. But my question is similar to the last in kind of the panel not maybe recognizing the actual physical limits of the Earth. I mean, silicon is mandatory for photovoltaic cells. It takes open pit mines to mine silicon in a lot of ways. And so I was curious about the panel's opinion on kind of a post-growth economy. Infinite growth on a finite planet is the way our economic system is currently set up. And so I was wondering about kind of your all's opinions on actual less usage and not just different kinds to continue the same consumption. I mean, for example, maybe in Afghanistan, instead of more and more military bases in an occupied land, how about no military in that land to begin with? And yeah, so in a lot of ways, I wish you were unemployed, General. But so I guess I wish we could talk more about just kind of actually decreasing usage and shifting the economy away from an insane growth on a finite planet.
Yeah. Can I jump on that first? Because that's a great point. I absolutely concur with you. I mean, the best way to have the most impact today is to reduce the energy that we consume. Developing renewables is going to take years and years and years. Now, let me give you a real life example. I was a senior logistics officer in Iraq, like I said. General Petraeus looked at me one day and said, "Steve, we need to get trucks off the road." I was bringing 1,000 trucks a day into Iraq to sustain the forces there. 300 were bringing nothing but fuel. So I asked the Army, hey, what can we do to develop, to help me reduce those 300 trucks, to cut it down to 200, 150? And they came back to me and they said, well, we can get solar, we can bring wind, we can develop geothermals, maybe we can get the Navy to bring in some nuke, this kind of thing. And I said, time out, I need something now. And a guy true story, a gentleman that worked at Tyson's Food, and evidently they refrigerate a lot of chicken. He came up with using closed cell spray polyurethane foam as an insulator on tents. And I had thousands and thousands and thousands of tents scattered all over Iraq. Every one of them had a 5-ton air conditioner at each end of the tent. And the representative can back me up on this because he went inside many of them, I'm sure. And so just by reducing the energy that we use to air condition those tents, by insulating them, something simple, cheap, effective, and available today, you know, we reduced the energy usage in some of the installations by half, cut them in half. And I actually had the Army study it, and they determined that we're saving $1 billion a year with a $95 million contract that did that. So I don't want to get too much into it, but I just want you to know that your point is absolutely spot on target. The first thing we got to do is reduce demand. That is the first thing we can do. Then we're at the point where now renewable energy can actually make a difference. But right now our energy demands are so huge, so vast, we're not doing smart things to manage and use our energy wisely, and consequently the renewables aren't really able to make a difference because the mountain is just too high to climb.
Did you tell Tyson's Food what how useful they were?
I'd probably have to pay him if I did. So, you know.
Yeah, it's. Let me agree in part and disagree in part with what you said. The part that I disagree with is if you're making a Malthusian prediction, I think that the people who've made Malthusian predictions have been proven wrong over and over.
There are physical limits to the planet? I mean,
yeah, but there's also a prediction that the horse manure in New York City would finally get to the 7th floor or something. But then a guy named Henry Ford came along and he invented automobiles, and there was no longer a horse manure problem in New York City. So if you project out current technologies, you do get in that problem. But I think it's a false choice, because what you have to do is you have to, with the proper incentives, and I agree with what the General just said, somebody will come up with a better metal than that one that exists. If you gotta, I mean, if there's a necessity as a mother of invention, and if the incentives are set up right so you can make a buck on it, it'll be pursued. Otherwise, it sticks in the current technology, right? And so here's some advice to you. If you're trying to reach your conservative friends, because we are the indispensable parties to action, just like our country is an indispensable nation, the indispensable parties to action in America are conservatives. If you come to them with Malthusian statements, they dismiss you immediately. And you know what? They're right. Because what you're saying is, for example, could be taken is we're going to leave Africa dark. And they're just going to have to stay dark. Well, no, I agree with the Heritage Foundation that says that would be immoral. They're actually right about that. It would be immoral to leave Africa dark. What we got to do is figure out a way to get more power, not less, more mobility, not less. Just figure out a way to do it with less. And that is a challenge we must accept. Is it not to say, listen, stinks for you in Africa, you don't have any lights at night. So how can you have great universities? Because nobody's studying at night. No, you got to figure out a way to get them lighted up at night, right? And so that's what conservatives say, and we're right about that. And frankly, I think liberals are off on that, because they sort of want to, and this is what conservatives really see. If you want me to hold the mirror for any liberals in the room, I'll tell you, this is how they think of you. That they think of you as you fly around like Al Gore does, and you ride in corporate jets, and you go in limousines, and that person is telling them to stop living in a suburb and driving their kids in their minivan to the soccer game. And they're saying, you're not going to tell me that. And so what you got to do, if you're the great one at the university, is figure out a way to light up Africa with less. So accept that challenge. So that's one thing I'd say to you. But now here's where I agree with you. And I think the General can definitely identify with this. I was going door to door one day, and the 10 cycle was getting tough, right? And so I came across this lady's house, and she said, we've been talking for a while. She identified herself as a retiree, and her husband is retired, and all the kids are grown and gone, and they're only there by themselves now. And she'd already told me that, and she said they, and what she meant by the context of the conversation is those enviros, they want us to drive smaller cars. And she says, how do they expect us to get our stuff around? She said, I've got 3 cats. And my chief of staff used to tell me, the problem with you, Bob, is you think you can convince anybody of anything. But I want you to know that at that door, and please tell Wayne Roper this if you see him, I moved on immediately from that door. I just said, great talking with you, and I moved on. Because I figured there was no hope at convincing that woman. But as I walked across her yard, I thought, somebody's kids are going to die on the sands of the Middle East so that she can drive her cats around. And that's not conservative. We got to figure out a way for her to be incentivized properly. If she wants to drive that Yukon and Suburban that she told me she has, fine, lady, pay the full price. And then you decide whether you want to drive that. And you don't need any pointy-head bureaucrat coming to tell you what kind of car to drive. But we will send her a price signal, and she will find out how dear some of that blood and treasure is that gets her that gasoline, and then she can decide whether she wants to pay that price. But she probably won't want to pay the price, and she will get in a more fuel-efficient car, and she will create a demand at that point. There'll be a demand push within the economy for technology. And then somebody will make a buck selling her an electric car. And then Haley will be selling her the power that powers that electric car. And exciting things will happen, and you avoid the Malthusian outcome. So, long sermon there. But.
And there should be a few minutes for private discussions, too. So but there's people chomping at the bit, so I want to move on. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
The guy sitting down there,
oh, were you? Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realize that.
We want Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Andy.
My question concerns from a political standpoint of how to do this. It seems hopeless. You look at Congress and the president, and they don't get along well. And as you say, you have to have the conservatives on board for the Democrats to get anything done. And a fundamental challenge seems to be that the oil and coal and gas industries have vast assets. They intend to burn all these assets and make hundreds of billions of dollars. And so what we need them to do to prevent catastrophic climate change is keep all those fossil fuels in the ground. And so they have been lobbying hard and spending hundreds of millions of dollars to confuse the issue and to buy off the politicians. And it seems rather hopeless. So from your political or military standpoint, how can this is a logjam, I think, how can that be broken?
Let me give you some encouragement. Political orthodoxies look like they never change, but consider how fast they change. One of my other heresies is I voted against the troop surge. I'm a pretty conservative fellow. I supported the troops fully, but I wasn't convinced that George Bush wasn't doing nation building, and I was, so the general disagrees with me about that. But I was
just the guy that had to do the troop surge. They didn't ask me.
I was concerned about the nation building aspect of that, had conservative concerns, right? But now look, Ron Paul got 25% of the Republican primary vote. That orthodoxy changed like that. That you can be Ron Paul and really do pretty well in a Republican primary. When I stated that heresy, it really was against the orthodoxy, but the encouraging thing is that orthodoxy changed rather rapidly. On immigration, you're watching an orthodoxy change in front of you as the Republicans. I mean, it is moving. So political orthodoxies change. Right now, the orthodoxy is against my position, which is conservatives should act on this, because as I go around singing this tune, it doesn't sound like what you hear on the radio. What you hear on the radio is something about how we'll just get more of that oil and keep on in that addiction that the general so rightly said is the problem. But I'm here to predict for you that eventually it'll switch, that conservatives will recognize it as, by golly, that's our story, that's our song. Creative destructionism, that's us. We're into people making a buck, selling new technologies. And we're into fair competitions and full accountability, that's us. And so it'll flip eventually, but we just got to make it flip by getting people, and really speak, if you're a progressive here, find a conservative friend and say, you know, have you heard there's a conservative way to do this? You don't have to do it the way that the bureaucrats want to do it. You can do it a different way.
Thank you. A couple of previous questions kind of set the stage for me, but I've worked in the mining industry in this region for almost the past 40 years. And there's been a real game changer in the coal industry. We can't deny that. But I think coal is what's brought this society to where it is today. Do we need to change? Yes, we're changing now. Natural gas has changed things, almost like Anthony Davis changed things for the University of Kentucky last year on the basketball court. But it's interesting. Appalachian coal is declining. However, Illinois coal is booming. They're mining more and more coal in Illinois, sending it to more and more southern states. Now, we mentioned renewables a while ago. The mining industry loves renewables because we have to mine a tremendous amount of material to make solar panels, to make windmills. Now, one word I didn't hear until just a few minutes ago was nuclear. We mentioned Jim Hansen from NASA and his views on climate change, but he's also a big proponent of nuclear power. And would you all care to comment on your thoughts on the future of nuclear power? Because renewables are only going to ever make up a small percentage. And really, if we replace coal, it's natural gas and nuclear in the foreseeable future, in my opinion.
I'll give it a shot. I support nuclear power. I look at it as a great bridging strategy to providing the energy needs that we need now to get us to the world in which we aren't here talking about generations of Kentuckians working in the coal industry, but we're talking about generation of Kentuckians working in the renewable energy industry. And I think that nuclear can help us get to that, that golden age out there someday. And so I'm pro-nuclear at this point. It certainly beats any of the carbon-based systems that we're using right now, in my humble opinion.
I just wanted, first of all, to call attention to a statement that you made that renewable energy will never provide all of our energy sources. It will. Why is that? Because coal is finite. Oil is finite, and even natural gas is finite. It takes millions of years to make them. We're not going to run out tomorrow. We're not going to run out in 10 years, but we will run out. So at some point in the future, we will be 100% renewable or we'll have no energy. That said, the issue of nuclear has some problems that we haven't become familiar with until recently. Now, I'm not talking about reactivity. I'm not talking about risk from accidents at all. I'm talking about climate change. Nuclear power requires cooling water. There has to be enough water, and it has to be cool enough to cool the plant. We have had some record heat waves and some record droughts, which have led to shutdowns of plants just when we need the electricity for air conditioning in the summer. France has gone largely nuclear, and they have had several summers in the last decade where they have had to shut down up to 30%, I think in one summer, up to 30% of their power generation because they didn't have the cool water. So although nuclear is a good bridging strategy, it actually makes us vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because you need that cool water. So in some places like Alaska, they are not going to run out of cool water. I can tell you that. But in other places like Georgia, that's a very real risk. And so I think we've mentioned before how certain types of energy are good for certain places. In West Texas, we have more wind than we know what to do with, for example. In other places, they have more cold water than they know what to do with. But there isn't, unfortunately, a silver bullet that will fix all of our problems all over the world at the same time, and that's the problem that we have.
Right, and I'd just add that that's why we want to, I would support a free enterprise competition among those fuels. Some places, some will work, some others will work. As for my views on nuclear, I'm a big fan of nuclear because it is a fallen world, and there are trade-offs in a fallen world, and nothing is perfect. It's got the problem of storage of the waste, but it doesn't have emissions, and that's a very positive thing. But also, if I could address the coal thing just briefly, is that, it's very important to point out, as the last question did, that nobody was evil for digging and burning coal. It's a great source of BTUs. It's just that we didn't know through many years, because we didn't recognize all those scientists that Katharine was talking about up there, the impacts. But now that we know, isn't it incumbent upon us to take off the blinders and deal with the facts? It's sort of like secondhand smoking. You know, we didn't know. And when I was a kid, you had ashtrays in your house. And people expected they would come into your house and smoke in your house. Now, can you imagine anybody coming into your house if you're not a smoker and lighting up? They don't do it, right? Because we come to understand that, no, that's just not something you do. So someday we will come to the place of saying, no, Elizabeth, you just can't keep on doing that. We love you, but you can't do that. And so figure out a way to hold your emissions, Elizabeth, in that bottle. And then you can compete. Otherwise, you know, we got to stop you. We got to have a cop on the beat through a price signal that says, listen, you got to be accountable for all that.
We're going to take questions from everybody who's in line before we close, and then we'll close. And so you're next.
Okay. Ms. Hayhoe, I wanted to say thank you for your efforts to try to bridge the faith communities and the environmental communities. I think it's a very difficult task, and I think it's crucial to solving some of our problems. You being a scientist, I wanted to direct a question to you, but also one to the congressman. I didn't hear any mention of what I have understood to be the other part of the global warming equation, and that is ocean acidification. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I haven't heard anybody mention that here this evening, and I think that could be the one that gets away from us even quicker than the one that the media tends to focus on, and politicians to varying extents. I'd like you to address that issue specifically, and for the congressman, you made some mention of full accountability for all the technologies that we want to use. There's a big stampede to natural gas. Everybody knows this. They use enormous amounts of water for these fracking processes they use. My question is, who is going to take the lead on spelling out the accounts, the effects of all of these technologies, kind of like a cradle to grave sort of analysis to take into account all the effects? Where do you see that coming from? Thank you.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mentioned that we've known about the impacts of carbon on climate for well over 200 years. The first climate model was actually calculated by hand in the 1890s. It took him 2 years to do it. His wife left him. What we haven't, what we haven't known of more than just a few decades is the fact that because most of this carbon dioxide is actually taken up by the ocean as well as by the atmosphere, in the ocean it's doing something different. It's not warming the ocean, it's actually acidifying it. And the problem is that acid tends to dissolve the hard shells of many organisms that live in the ocean. So there are projections that within a matter of decades there may be no coral reefs left in US waters because they will be dissolving in the water as it becomes more acidic. It's affecting the base of our food chain, and it could have repercussions all the way up to the things that we rely on to eat. And so ocean acidification is a little bit like the kind of the sleeping giant that we did not really focus on until recently, and it could have enormous repercussions because that's where the carbon goes. It doesn't hang around the atmosphere forever. It gets taken up into the ocean over decades and even centuries, and once it's there, we have a much more acidic ocean than we did before, and there's a lot of things that can't live in acid.
Yeah, and that's why I love the title of your book, Katharine, because, you know, it's one thing to lose a polar bear or something at the top of the food chain. It's quite another to open up a hole in the bottom of the food chain. Because if you dissolve the calcium-based plankton and you destroy that, you're taking a hole out of the bottom of the food chain. And talk about the instability that the general mentioned. A billion people around the world depend on the ocean for food. If you take that away, wow, do you have some instability. You've got So yes, it's a great question. Ocean acidification is key to, is a really important thing to ask. As the second part of the question, it's about typically states have regulated. I think I'm correct about this. I'm not an expert. I'm from South Carolina. Okay, so we don't do much of this oil and gas stuff there. But I believe I'm correct in saying that it's typically been the prerogative of states to regulate oil and gas extraction, but of course, there's an overlap with the EPA, particularly when it comes to groundwater contamination issues associated with fracking. And that is something that I believe does need attention, because you want to make sure you're not getting groundwater contamination from the pulling the goo up that you just fracked with and putting it in an unlined recovery pool. That could get to groundwater contamination. And that some states are doing better than others, is my understanding. But I'm not, like you say, South Carolina, we don't do much of that. And I'd have to rely on somebody from Texas or Oklahoma or somewhere like that to help me figure out that out better. But I hope I'm answering that. Yeah.
We can do that.
There you go. There's Texas.
We're going to take 3 more questions, but I do want to point out Dr. Hayhoe is going to have a book signing in the back for her book. So if you're interested in that and can stick around, there'll be that opportunity. Cool.
We're a little bit tired of the fact that corporations are no longer held, as they were originally in this country, to serving the common good. They are now told that it is their responsibility to look at the bottom line, and that bottom line for them is not just a buck, but it is an overwhelming body of wealth that is controlling this nation and making it impossible for us to make change. So I hope when you think about being a good steward, you'll include in that being a good steward of one another who are doing the backbreaking work and not making a living wage. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Mr. Inglis what you think of the possibilities for carbon tax being passed in Obama's second term. Okay. And I also would ask all 3 of you, for those of us who do want to initiate change, we recognize the seriousness of the crisis and we have limited energy. Who should we be talking to? What group is most important for us to address now?
If I could just jump in on that last question, one of the organizations that I really appreciate is Citizens Climate Lobby. They were started by a real estate agent in California, is my understanding, and it is a group of citizens in every state and increasingly in Canadian provinces also, who organize to talk to their elected representatives. We live in a society where our leaders are elected, and that organization makes a concerted effort to get real people in to talk about their concerns related to climate. And so for many of us, it's very challenging to figure out how to do that on our own, but that's what they're doing. And so if anybody's looking for people to help you get in and talk to people, Citizens Climate Lobby is really a great organization.
Probably turn it over to you. Yeah, and they are a wonderful organization. Marshall Saunders started that. He's a great fella, and it's so. Second part of the question first. You'll pardon me because this is my target audience. Please find a conservative friend of yours or family member, because really they're the indispensable party. We're the indispensable nation. It's great if you get your, if you're progressive and you got progressive friends and you want to have them over for wine and cheese, great. But really, you got to find somebody down at the diner that's a Republican conservative who is ready to act too, and you gotta win them over. So if you don't, we really can't move. And the answer to your first question is, until we have conservatives coming up out of the foxholes that they are currently hiding in, knowing that this is real, knowing that people like Katharine are not godless scientists who are trying to mislead us in this grand global conspiracy, but rather that they are people who have given their life to scientific inquiry, and that we should listen to them. Until we have those folks coming up out of those foxholes and saying we're going to take this hill we're not going to get there. And so what you got to do is give them a little bit of covering fire. You got to help them with your conservative friends. Say, listen, talk with your senators here in Kentucky. Talk to Rand Paul. Let me tell you. Let me tell you what to say to him.
Oh, yeah.
Hold on.
Take
I got
notes.
something to say. I got the lines for you. In the case of Rand Paul, tell him you're a libertarian, and you believe in efficient markets, right? And you believe in accountability, and you believe that people should pay for what they get, right? Libertarians believe that you shouldn't have public roads, you should have toll roads that people pay to use. Okay, let's follow that principle. In other words, give people the opportunity to live to what they say they believe. Give him the opportunity through something like Citizens Climate Lobby or just going to see him on your own. Give him the opportunity to live what he says he believes. He says he believes in accountable marketplaces. Give him the opportunity to live to that. And say, listen, Senator, there are unrecognized negative externalities or hidden costs or Elizabeth blowing bubbles, whatever you want to call it. Won't you attach those costs? And don't you believe there's a market distortion? And don't libertarians go batty about that idea of inefficient markets? Answer all those questions is yes, they do. So live to what you believe, Senator. And then in the case of Mitch McConnell, maybe what you can say to him is, yo, Senator, you want to stay, you want to be maybe the majority leader of the U.S. Senate someday? Well, have you noticed what's happened with young people? They're taking econ, chemistry, and physics at the University of Kentucky, and they understand this stuff. It's just their parents and grandparents that don't. But have you noticed that people die? And if you plan on having a party that survives, and you want it not to be the grumpy old party, but perhaps become the grand opportunity party, maybe you want to get with it. And maybe since he's getting with it, he's hearing that, he heard the footsteps on immigration in this last presidential election, did he not? He can hear the footsteps if you hold a microphone to him here at the University of Kentucky, to these young folks that say, why do you have this real problem with this ideology that's going to be overrun by the facts? You know, it's clear that a shaky ideology is eventually overrun by facts. And so I think you can get to Senator McConnell on that basis. But call me a dreamer, I realize I'm a dreamer, right? But I believe that you should give people the opportunity to live to what they believe, and then you should expect that really they can understand this stuff. One way or another, we'll get there.
Last question.
I'll try to make this short, concise, and to the point. In February of 2007, I stood before the Planning Commission at the Irving County government, and I gave a presentation very similar to what you guys gave this evening. And their reaction, needless to say, was not enthusiastic. They did not implement a single recommendation because they believed that free market solutions would help people and that Lexington, Fayette County is a relatively wealthy area and these sorts of things would just not happen to them. Fast forward 6 years later, there are entire neighborhoods that now have no access to automobiles. They are priced out of the market. There are entire neighborhoods without commercial grocery stores. There are entire neighborhoods who don't have access to health care. And the free market is not rushing in to provide services to these people because they can't pay for it. The median income in Fayette County is right now a little more than $48,000 a year. It has dropped substantially over the last decade. The fact is the free market solutions that you're touting require people who can afford to pay for them. And that's not happening, and it's not going to happen. The second point I would like to make, or like for you to address, is that the United States has 5% of the world's population, give or take. And we use, give or take, 40% of the world's resources every year. I really have to take extreme exception to you saying everybody can have an American standard of living. Americans can't have an American standard of living if everybody is going to be equal and fair. The rest of the world is not going to continue to allow us to exploit them and steal their resources for pennies on the dollar for private use forever. They're starting to demand their fair share, and they're going to get it. And expecting private enterprise to have all the resources that Americans are going to need, like universally accessible mass transit, just for an example, relocalized food production, free enterprise won't step in until it's profitable. Why do you think government doesn't need to step up to the plate? The infrastructure for mass transit, for example, has to be in place before gasoline is $10 a gallon, not after. After, no one's going to be able to afford mass transit infrastructure placement. That's one example among many. Why do you think the free market is going to address this? It has never successfully addressed any tragedy of the commons in history. It's not going to start now. Thank you.
Yeah. The last point is particularly strong, and I think you're right. If you don't have accountability, you do have the tragedy of the commons, and it really, that's a failure that has to be addressed by government, right? You have to move in with a cop on the beat to say, no, listen, we're going to hold Elizabeth accountable, right? You're going to end the tragedy of the commons. So, but if taking up the second part, which is the other countries of the world, actually. This is a place where America, the blessed, exists to be a blessing. And you know what? We, by developing technology, give developing countries the opportunity to leapfrog. So in our country, we had a bunch of copper wires in the ground that were owned by AT&T. Who cares now? If you're in Africa, you could care less about copper wires in the ground. Because with the technology that we have in cell phones, you don't need them anymore. And in the development of pharmaceuticals, another place where this is one place where really Americans might be able to feel a little bit less guilty at night. We do have some problems about caring for the rest of the world, and particularly our faith should address, or should impel us to do something about that, compel us to do something about that. But when you turn off the lights tonight, you might feel a little bit better about your circumstances as Americans, realizing that the development of those drugs aimed at the American market means that the rest of the world gets to buy them at the variable cost, not the fixed cost associated with those drugs. And so it's another place where we benefit the rest of the world, right? Now, of course, you can point out that, yes, but a lot of that development was aimed at something like Viagra and not at, say, malaria reduction, and that is a problem. But I guess it's a mixed bag, in other words. But my confidence in the free enterprise system is that how else are you going to do it? Are you going to do it through a centrally planned bureaucratic welfare state? Well, I got to tell you, if they're progressive, yeah, we did that once called the Soviet Union, right? And if you're a progressive here and that's what you're thinking is your way, I would suggest to you there are other footprints or footsteps that you might want to hear at your doorstep, which is all the young progressives at UK leaving you because they are long ago disillusioned with a bureaucratic welfare state. They think that these big buildings we have downtown that are rectangular generally, and they're about 4 stories tall, and they're really ugly, they're built in the 70s, with these bureaucrats in there running things and planning things, those young progressives think they have failed miserably. And they want new solutions. They want something that works about like this, and as quickly as this works. Because they say, why can't you do food stamps all this way? And you know, there are some things we can do with food stamps this way. There are a lot of things we can do better. So why are we sticking with these old systems? And so when it comes to mass transit, the thing that I would offer you is another Malthusian escape here, is when the car is driverless, and as Bill Gates said to a technology group in Washington I was part of one time, he said, not a question of if, it's a question of when. In the future there will be no accidents, because my car will know where your car is. And so in the future, I mean, and I don't think this is very far away, because people are going to have a profit motive to do this, my car is going to be 6 feet away from yours, and we're going to be going 85 miles an hour down a compressed highway. We're going to need less highways, and it's going to be essentially a train. but it's going to be powered by my car having its own power system and yours, and it's going to fit America. If you're in Europe and you're, you like close-knit communities that are really tight geographically, transportation like that works great. But if you're in South Carolina or a lot of places in Kentucky, you can't make a train work. It doesn't work. The numbers aren't there. But if my car can be 6 feet away from your car and we're traveling down the road rather rapidly, we get compression of, we get less use for, less transportation dollars. Right. Actually, I am a very rich congressman because did you know that after one term in office, you get $1 million a year in retirement? It says so on the internet. And I keep trying to say to my banker, listen, Bruce, I'm sure it's going to happen. They're going to send me that $1 million. They're starting soon. Why don't you go ahead and advance the money to me? Sorry, it doesn't happen that way. Don't run for Congress to try to get that great deal because it's not that great. You're onto something very serious, right? And it's something that, frankly, if I had the answer to, I'd be running for president right now, but I don't have the answer to, so I'm not running for president, and also I don't have the hair for it, because you have to have presidential hair. But it's how do you deal with income disparity? And it is a real challenge. And the earlier question, I think, and this is off the topic maybe, but it is a huge challenge, is how do you, in a global economy, people at the top with capital, either money in the bank or intellectual capital, can do real well. If you're not in that situation, you may be pushed to the bottom, and there really is a hollowing out in the middle. That is a huge challenge for our country. I wish I had a real good answer for it. I really don't have a real good answer for it. A lot of it comes from faith that, there should be some element of shame in paying yourself 800x the average paid person in your operation. There should be some sense that maybe I'm not worth 800 times what the average person makes in my operation. Maybe, 50s and 60s, it was 40x. Perhaps we should have some sense of propriety there. But that comes not from a government regulation in one of those bureaucratic boxes downtown, but rather from some sense of propriety out of faith, I think.
I'd just like to simply say, ma'am, I'm going to say something you're not going to want to hear. But free market economy is not the problem. Free market economy is the solution. It is the only way that we're going to get out of this mess and we're going to fix energy usage in this nation. It's the only way. Free market driving the development of a renewable energy economy in this nation. Free market economy made America what we are today, made it the envy of the world. When I go all over the world, to places like Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan, all over the world, they all say the same thing.
Stop bombing us.
They say, we love Americans, we want American technology, and we want a free market economy just like you, so we can grow and prosper and become, the kind of responsible worldwide citizens that Americans have proven themselves to be.
Now, I want to close it with that. Thank you, General and Bob and Katharine. We are going to have a short book signing. There's some wonderful copies of this wonderful book back in the back. And also I want to point out that Bob Inglis has a very lucid op-ed piece that was in Sunday's paper, copies of which are back there. It's really worth reading if you haven't seen it. These people have not had dinner yet, so we will have a short book signing. We'll be gone probably about 15 minutes.
Free market economy, here we come.
So join me in thanking the speakers once again.